resources are not infinite, right? Every dollar that's used to on, spending time trying to hunt down SKS rifles is less police resources, personnel that could be used to actually stop, violent crime in our communities, could stop illegal guns being sent over the border, that's actually being used for, violent crime in this country.
So, folks, big news for taxpayers coming from a Saturday where the public safety minister announced that the federal government is pushing full steam ahead with its gun confiscation program. That means it's rolling out the program across the country, starting on January 19th. The government said you can put in a declaration to say you want to get the compensation back for your banned firearm, and you have until March 31st to do that. Now, of course, we're still going to be talking about how much of a waste of money this program is, how useless it's going to be in actually making Canadians safer. But with this new announcement of it going national, I brought on the CTF's General Counsel, Devin Drover, to kind of talk about what it still means legally for taxpayers who own these guns. Do they have to give them back? Do they not? Is it voluntary? What's that looking like? So to start off, Devin, we got this announcement on Saturday. I mean, it shows the government doesn't have too much confidence in its own program when it's doing press conferences on Saturday. We got those two dates now. We got the amnesty. We've got that March 31st deadline for talking about the guns. What does that mean for taxpayers? Where are we looking at in the whole legal front on this right now?
Yeah, so I mean, one, I think it's hilarious to actually see a politician working on a Saturday and, for a change. I wish it was a little something better for taxpayers than this, but still nice to see them get out of bed at a decent time on a Saturday. Whether or not it changes things, I hate to use the lawyer answer, it depends, but it does depend. So there's a couple things here. So one, there's still an amnesty period, which an amnesty period is basically a grace period in the law. The government still has banned those firearms, but it's holding off for now on, charging people on holding people criminally responsible just for possession of the firearms that are on that list. While it tries to figure out how they're going to make this confiscation scheme work, and we'll talk about it in a little while, why, that
Yeah.
may not happen. But as of today, the amnesty still is in existence. It still runs until October 30th, 2026, so October of this year. What Ottawa has now announced is kind of a separate piece from the amnesty is a declaration window. And really this is for taxpayers where a bit of personal choice comes into it. So from now until March 31st, 2026, owners can decide whether or not to declare their firearms for the quote unquote compensation element of this. Declaring is still voluntary. There is no obligation underneath the law. You're still legally entitled to possess those firearms. You do not need to declare. But what it does do is preserve a chance, and I think a chance is an important word here, that you may get compensated if they come and take your property, if they come and take your quote unquote banned firearms. But it does not guarantee a payout in their own words because the government itself says compensation depends on a number of factors, including available funds. At the same time, not declaring does not make it, does not make the law disappear. So owners still need to take action before the amnesty expires, or they do risk potential criminal penalties later. So again, people are forced to make this personal decision in a system that's still very uncertain. And that uncertainty matters, folks, because this program is clearly not going smoothly. This amnesty date, we've already seen get pushed back a number of times, multiple times, after Ottawa ran into serious political and logistical problems rolling this out. And folks, a lot of things could still happen. We are in a minority parliament. That means nothing is locked in. A snap election, a change in government, or sustained public pressure could absolutely change this again. So, we don't need to admit defeat yet. That's exactly the opposite of my message here. From a political perspective, we still should hold out hope here, and we're going to keep the pressure on so this costly and unfair compensation plan does not come in fruition, and that we continue the public debate on this important issue.
Yeah, Devin, I think there's two really important things there that you highlighted. Obviously, the general advice to gun owners from your legal perspective is always welcomed and important. But also, when we talk about the compensation there, right? So I think a lot of people might be feeling some pressure to say, well, I've only got this certain amount of time. I could use a couple bucks if the government's going to take my guns anyway. But the important part about that to highlight is that the government has said they only have 250 odd million set up for the compensation part, whereas the parliamentary budget officer has said that costs could get into the 800 million. So if you're looking to take a stand for now, it's the time to do it because even if you fill out that declaration, get everything set up, it's actually pretty unlikely from a lot of sources that you're going to get a bunch of money from the government on this. And in all likelihood, they're just going to not get that compensation because it says, as you said, right on their website, that compensation is not guaranteed when you do that declaration. So I think taxpayers should think about that. And in relation to going forward on that, they should think about it because it's going to be so difficult for Ottawa to actually follow through on this program. Taxpayers still have ways to fight back. And the first part we saw about that is how they decided to have the press conference on a Saturday. Folks, governments, it's a little inside secret that when a government has good news, they'll do it in the middle of the day on a Monday or a Tuesday when all the journalists are fresh-faced and bushy-tailed and ready to get back to work. For news they would like people to not cover or deal with, they'll do it on a Friday afternoon after the journalists have already went to the bar, or on a Saturday when they're nursing the hangover to try and get as little coverage on that as possible. So even Ottawa knows that this isn't something they think is going to work. And it's clear because of all the opposition that not only taxpayers are doing at the CTF and supporters like you, but from the provinces and local police forces, right? The minister even stood up on Saturday and said that right now they cannot launch the program in Alberta and Saskatchewan because of the legal hurdles there. And that's because Premier Scott Moe and Premier Daniel Smith have been fighting the gun ban and they've passed laws to make it more difficult. But it's not just them, right? There's other premiers who have said that they're just not going to participate. We've got Wab Kinew recently who basically said we don't want to get involved in this massive headache. That's an NDP premier of Manitoba. We've also got the Toronto Police Force, the Ontario Provincial Police saying they aren't helping. And that's clear also because we just released a poll in Ontario that shows that almost double the amount of Ontarians want the government to focus on giving more money to police forces than on the gun confiscation. So we're looking at all of these angles, huge opposition from everyone across the country. It's clear that this program still might not get off the ground, so taxpayers can still dig in their heels and at least keep their guns until that amnesty date. Am I being a little bit too positive, Devin, or do you think this is still the right place to take?
No, I mean, absolutely. Again, it's a personal decision, but at this point, it's very clear this is not just a small number of gun owners complaining about this. It's governments of multiple stripes, as we've seen recently with Premier Wab Kinew. We've seen with, Premier Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, Premier Daniel Smith in Alberta. We've had comments against this program from the Premier of Nova Scotia, Tim Houston. We've had somewhat positive comments from Premier Doug Ford in Ontario. We've had the Charlottetown City Hall just rejected participation in the program unanimously recently, last month. It's very clear that Ottawa is not listening to people who actually understand how firearms are used in real life. And I think it's very clear that this program still very well could fail. I mean, there's more things that need to happen. We got to keep the pressure up on politicians, including, those like Canoe who have started to speak out about it. But, what is louder than words is action. So we need to actually see that come to fruition in which they actually start to do similar things that Alberta and Saskatchewan's doing and make it more difficult for um, this the federal government to come in and start to try to take firearms from law-abiding Canadians. So it is again a personal choice whether or not someone wants to participate at this stage, but there's no reason absolutely to do so. We do have a lot of opposition still mounting in this country. I'm certain we're not going to let loose on this issue. So we need to keep up the good work on fighting the federal government to stop this program that will do nothing to make Canadians safer, but will certainly cost them a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. I think the Charlottetown one is such a good example because, as we talked about, on Prince Edward Island, all four of their members of parliament are liberal, right? So that's the party doing the gun ban. So we saw the city council, despite that, just look at the facts and say this gun confiscation is only going after law-abiding firearm owners. It's not doing anything to stop criminals. We're not participating in it. That's a huge win for taxpayers and puts pressure on our side. And then just a little bit hip skip and a jump away in Cape Breton, the government has already failed on their first actual test of this program too. They only got 25 out of the 200 guns they wanted from only 16 people. It's clearly failing.
Yeah, and I mean on that, it's another great example, and we've covered that Cape Breton protest a number of times, and the failure of the confiscation program there. You know, though that's another area where both members of parliament are Liberal MPs, and even they, even the government party in ridings with government MPs couldn't get people out to give up their firearms. It's very clear that this is not something that, Canadian taxers want, regardless of their political stripe, regardless of who they vote for. At some point, it starts to look like a policy driven by ideology in Ottawa instead of evidence. I mean, Ottawa keeps expanding the scope, ignoring experts, ignoring Indigenous leaders, ignoring community leaders, ignoring, front of the line police force, and hoping it all works out later. But, taxpayers are going to be the ones footing the bill for this. And this is why it's so important we keep up the pressure.
No, exactly, because it is, as we mentioned before, and as we're going to go into now, all it is getting more and more difficult for Ottawa to actually follow through on this wasteful program. And I think the biggest thing that people need to talk about more is not just the premier's opposition, not just the police forces, even though that is important, and it's great that premiers are standing up and talking about how much of a waste this is. The biggest problem that Ottawa has in its entire gun control scheme is a three-letter word called the SKS. That's the real problem here. So the SKS is an old rifle invented by the Soviets, and it's something that a lot of the gun control groups in Canada want to ban. So essentially, a short history lesson, they invented the SKS. It was a self-loading semi-automatic rifle, but was almost immediately made obsolete by something called the AK-47. So they built millions of these, and then they started shipping them over to countries like Canada for people to buy to have fun with because they were so cheap, the ammo was so cheap, and they're tons of fun. But the problem is that all the gun control groups in this country want to ban this weapon. Now it seems like what's the problem there though, right? Because they've banned tons of other guns, but the problem is because there's so many of them and the people who like to use them, it's a huge problem for the government. So Devin, there's estimated to be about 1.7 million SKSs in the country, give or take, which is a lot. And SKSs are also very popular with indigenous communities across the country. There's a few freezers full of moose in this country that have been shot with an SKS. So the last time the government tried to move to ban this in Bill C-21, the Assembly of First Nations automatically passed an emergency resolution saying these are tools that we use in our everyday life for hunting. These aren't these weapons of war that the anti-gun lobby wants you to think it is. And that's where it's pushing. That's the problem right now, is that there's so many of these guns, which means huge enforcement costs for Ottawa. They're really important with Indigenous hunters who use them for their traditional hunting rights that they have under treaty. But the anti-gun lobby isn't backing down either. But until that problem is solved, there's really no way to get anywhere fully on this gun control issue in the country.
Yeah, I mean, the point about the SKS really shows how disconnected this policy is from reality. It's not some new or exotic firearm. It's been around forever, and it's widely used by Indigenous hunters and other people in rural communities. And even leaders who, have supported other restrictions, or, have not been as such a strong, opponent of this policy, Premier Wap Kinew being an example of that, have warned Ottawa that going after firearms like the SKS creates serious problems, especially for Indigenous communities that rely on them for hunting. And you mentioned, this is going to become a huge resource cost for the federal government. And, resources are not infinite, right? Every dollar that's used on, spending time trying to hunt down SKS rifles is less, police resources, personnel that could be used to actually stop, violent crime in our communities, could stop illegal guns being sent over the border, that's actually being used for, violent crime in this country. So, it's so important that we never get away from that point, that every dollar that is being wasted on this program is money that's taken away from taxpayers and being wasted on things that could, or sorry, that is not being spent on things that could actually reduce crime in this country.
Right, and that's exactly right. I mentioned that there's an estimated about 1.7 million SKSs in the country, and you sounds like okay, just it's going to take a lot of money to track all those down. But that's the key part too, is the government actually has to track them down. Since the SKS is a non-restricted rifle, the government actually has no idea where these firearms are. It's all based off of hearsay and everything like that. So if the government were to commit to this, like you're saying, the cost would be astronomical. And then again, it wouldn't make anyone safer because all the people who own these rifles or who own them legally with a PAL, the only people who could participate in some sort of government gun confiscation and compensation scheme, are not the one committing crime. So you make the super important point there that every single dollar the government commits to controlling guns owned by lawful Canadians is a dollar that can't be spent on actually reducing crime. Now, Devin, if you'll indulge me, I'll go into what exactly the total costs are going to be for taxpayers on this program because the government's been anything but clear. So we go all the way back 2019. Liberals first started musing about this program. They said $200 million is what it's going to cost in total for everything. Now, of course, that didn't hold water for very long. The parliamentary budget officer said, as we mentioned earlier, $756 million just to compensate for the firearms. But then we get some other people who do independent studies who say 6 billion, right? So that 6 billion number is, I think, what taxpayers need to think about because the government's been tossing around, oh, we have a budget of $742 million. I mean, folks, when was the last time the government stuck to their budget on anything, especially something as complicated as gun control, right? So the government can tell you they're going to spend this much. It's very likely they're going to spend much more, and the bill to use a taxpayer is going to be much higher. But then they're going to spend all this money, and as we've alluded to over the course of this video, it's going to do absolutely nothing to make anyone in this country safer. Because the only people who can participate in this gun confiscation program are people who owned the guns legally before, and those people are very not likely to commit crimes with their firearms. We've got the police who are saying the same things, right? The RCMP, this union has talked about how this diverts huge resources away from the real problem of illegal guns. The president of the Toronto Police Association says it straight up, where he's like, this is going to have very little impact on the crime in Toronto. And we're seeing other police forces across the country say the same thing. All this gun confiscation is going to do is cost taxpayers a boatload of money without making anyone safer. And that's why, despite Ottawa rolling out the program nationally, taxpayers are still going to be fighting it, still going to be pushing back to try and limit the cost to taxpayers as much as possible and try and push the government to actually go for solutions that actually make Canadians safer. But on that, Devin, as the resident legal expert, do you have any last words for taxpayers on this? What's the best thing people should be doing right now? What they should be thinking about? Where can they go for updates? What's happening in the fight against Ottawa's gun ban?
Great, Gage. So I got 2 points on that. The first, and this is the core legal point, I think, is to stay informed. The rules keep changing. Ottawa keeps moving the goalposts. So folks need to stay informed so that they know their legal rights and they know, how to be best protected in the fight against this policy. So the way to do that, subscribe to this channel for updates, sign our petition at taxpayer.com so we can keep you in the loop. And of course, share this video with family and friends who need to know what's going on. The more people paying attention, the harder it is for government to push this through quietly. But the second point is we do need to keep up the pressure. Pressure, we've already seen this, political pressure from taxpayers in places like Cape Breton, in Charlottetown, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, has already forced meaningful pushback against this policy. And that didn't happen by accident, folks. It happened because people like you, shared our videos, showed up to rallies, emailed their politicians. We need to make sure politicians keep hearing from taxpayers across this country that this policy will not make your community safer, but will cost a massive amount of money. And, silence is how bad policy survives. So we need to keep the pressure on. And this is especially true for those, places I didn't name places like Manitoba where they can take further action, places like Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec. We see from the polling data that, taxpayers don't want this. They want their resources spent in other ways. So it's time to continue to put pressure on the political leaders in those places to make that meaningful change. So that's kind of the big second point here. Let's keep up the pressure, folks.
Yeah, you heard it here first and from Devin. Speak up, email your premier if they haven't came out against this gun confiscation. Email your member of parliament if they're supporting the gun confiscation still. Make this as hard as possible for Ottawa to push through to save taxpayers money and actually push forward policy that make people safer.